The bullet had gone clean through her husband's chest 3 hours before the snow started falling. And now Penelope Carter knelt in the accumulating white powder beside a shallow grave she had dug with her own bleeding hands, while the December wind howled across the Kansas plains like a chorus of the damned. She had loved Thomas Carter for exactly 8 months, married him in a hasty ceremony in Newton back in April of 1876, and believed with the foolish optimism of her 22 years that their cattle ranch 15 miles outside town would become something grand and prosperous. The Sioux warriors who had ridden through their property that afternoon had other ideas, caught up in the desperation of a people being systematically destroyed, lashing out at any white settlers they encountered. Thomas had tried to reason with them, explain they meant no harm, but reason was a luxury neither side could afford anymore. The shot came from a young brave's rifle, and Thomas had looked at her with such surprise, such confusion, before he crumpled into the dirt. Penelope had hidden in the root cellar while they ransacked the house and barn, taking their 3 horses, the winter provisions, everything of value. When silence finally returned and she emerged to find Thomas still breathing shallowly, she had dragged him inside, tried desperately to stop the bleeding, whispered prayers she had learned as a child in Philadelphia to a God who seemed to have abandoned this brutal frontier entirely. He died as the sun touched the horizon, his last words a whispered apology that broke something fundamental inside her chest. The ground was already starting to freeze, making burial nearly impossible, but she refused to leave him for the wolves and coyotes. Her hands blistered and bled as she scraped at the earth with a rusted shovel, her dress soaked through with melting snow and mud, her blonde hair plastered to her face. When the hole was barely deep enough, she wrapped Thomas in their wedding quilt and lowered him as gently as her exhausted muscles allowed. She tried to say something meaningful, some final words of love or farewell, but her voice came out as animal sounds, raw and broken. Now she knelt there as darkness gathered and snow fell harder, weeping into the white powder that was already covering the fresh-turned earth. Hot tears melted tiny craters in the snow before her, and she watched them form and fill with a distant fascination, her mind unable to fully process the nightmare her life had become in a single afternoon. She had no horse, no provisions, no way to reach Newton through what was rapidly becoming a blizzard. The house was destroyed, the winter supplies gone, and she realized with dull certainty that she would likely freeze to death before morning. Part of her welcomed it. Part of her wanted to simply lie down beside Thomas's grave and let the snow cover her like a burial shroud. Let the cold take her somewhere beyond this agony. She was so focused on these dark thoughts that she did not hear the horse approaching until it was nearly upon her, did not register another human presence until a shadow fell across her, and a man's voice spoke quietly through the wind. "Madam, you cannot stay out here." Penelope looked up slowly, her vision blurred by tears and snow, and saw a cowboy sitting astride a sturdy roan mare, his face shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He was tall even seated, broad-shouldered beneath a heavy canvas duster, and something in his weathered face suggested he had seen enough of life's cruelty to recognize it in others. "Leave me alone," she managed to say, her voice a hoarse rasp. The cowboy dismounted in one fluid motion and approached her carefully, as one might approach a wounded animal. When he crouched beside her, she saw he was perhaps 30 years old, with deep-set hazel eyes that held an unexpected gentleness. Snow had gathered on his dark brown hair and the stubble covering his jaw. "I have been tracking those raiders since they hit the Jacobson place yesterday morning," he said quietly. "I saw the smoke from your chimney fire dying and came to investigate." "Madam, I am truly sorry for your loss, but you will die out here if you do not come with me now." "I do not care," Penelope said and meant it. "I have nothing left. He was everything." The cowboy was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving from the fresh grave to her bloodied hands to her face, reading the story written there. Then he did something unexpected. He removed one of his gloves and reached out, his calloused fingers impossibly gentle as they brushed the tears from her frozen cheeks. "I know that feeling," he said softly. "I know it better than I wish, but your husband would not want you to freeze beside his grave. Let me help you." Something in his tone, in the genuine understanding that colored his words, penetrated the fog of Penelope's grief. She found herself looking at him, really looking and seeing not pity but recognition, as though he had stood exactly where she knelt now and somehow survived it. "Who are you?" She whispered. "Henry Fletcher," he said. "I work for the Johnson Ranch about 8 miles north of here. I am tracking those warriors to see which direction they are headed, try to warn other settlers in their path. I can take you to Newton, get you somewhere safe and warm." Penelope looked back at the grave, now just a white mound in the darkness. The thought of leaving Thomas here alone seemed impossible, unbearable. But she was already losing feeling in her feet, and her hands shook uncontrollably. Henry Fletcher waited patiently, not rushing her, and somehow that patience made the difference. "All right," she finally said. Henry helped her to her feet, and when her legs nearly buckled from cold and exhaustion, he steadied her with a firm grip on her arm. He led her to his horse and lifted her into the saddle with surprising care, then mounted behind her. Penelope was too numb to feel self-conscious about the intimacy of the position as he wrapped his duster around them both and spurred the mare into a careful walk through the deepening snow. "There is an abandoned line shack about 3 miles west," Henry said, his voice close to her ear. "We will never make Newton in this storm, but we can shelter there until it passes." Penelope did not respond, simply let herself be carried through the white darkness, Henry's arms around her as he handled the reins. She could feel the solid warmth of him at her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and something in her animal brain recognized safety, even as her conscious mind remained lost in grief. The line shack materialized from the snow like a ghost, a small rough structure that cattle ranchers used during roundups. Henry dismounted and helped Penelope down, then led his horse into the attached lean-to shelter before guiding her inside the shack itself. It was barely one room, containing an old potbelly stove, a wooden bunk built into one wall, and little else. But it was out of the wind, and when Henry got a fire going in the stove using kindling from a stack in the corner, warmth began to spread through the space. Penelope stood motionless in the center of the room, dripping melted snow onto the rough floorboards, still unable to fully process what was happening. Henry studied her with concern, then moved to the saddlebags he had brought inside. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said. "I have a spare shirt and some long underwear. They will be too large, but they are dry." When Penelope did not move or respond, Henry approached her carefully and began helping her out of her soaked coat and dress with the impersonal efficiency of someone tending to a shock victim. His touch was respectful, his eyes averted when necessary, and Penelope felt too hollowed out to feel anything about it. She let him dress her in his clothes, which indeed swallowed her smaller frame, then allowed him to guide her to the bunk and wrap her in the blankets he found there. Henry examined her hands by the light of the fire, his expression tightening when he saw the torn skin and broken blisters. He had water in his canteen and cloth in his pack, and he cleaned and wrapped her hands with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his rough cowboy exterior. "Thank you," Penelope managed to say, the first words she had spoken since they left the grave. "No need," Henry said. He moved to tend the fire, adding more wood, then settled onto the floor with his back against the wall, giving her the only bed. "Try to rest. The storm should pass by morning." But Penelope could not rest. She lay in the bunk staring at the ceiling while images of Thomas's death played repeatedly in her mind, each detail sharp and terrible. She heard again the crack of the rifle, saw again the surprise in his eyes, felt again the sticky warmth of his blood on her hands. Tears leaked from the corners of her eyes and tracked into her hair. "Tell me about him," Henry said quietly from his spot by the stove. Penelope turned her head to look at him. He was watching the fire, his profile sharp in the flickering light. "Why?" she asked. "Because talking sometimes helps, because silence can be worse." He glanced at her. "And because I suspect you have no one else to tell." He was right about that. Penelope had no family in Kansas, no close friends in Newton yet. She and Thomas had been building their life in relative isolation. Two dreamers from back east who thought they could tame the frontier through hard work and love. The words began to come haltingly at first, then faster, spilling out of her like water from a broken dam. She told Henry about meeting Thomas in Philadelphia, how he had courted her with poetry and promises of adventure. About their wedding and the train journey west, filled with hope and excitement. About their first sight of the land they had purchased, how empty and vast it seemed, both terrifying and thrilling. About the months of back-breaking work, building the house and barn, trying to establish their herd. About small moments of happiness, Thomas singing while he worked, dancing with her in the kitchen by lamplight, planning the family they would raise. Henry listened without interrupting, occasionally feeding the fire, his presence somehow making it easier to speak. When Penelope finally fell silent, exhausted by the outpouring, he was quiet for a while before speaking. "I lost my wife 4 years ago," he said. "Her name was Catherine. She died bringing our daughter into the world, and the baby died 2 days later. I blamed myself for a long time. Thought if I had not brought her out here, if we had stayed in Missouri near proper doctors, maybe things would have been different." Penelope felt her breath catch. She sat up slowly, looking at him with new understanding. "I am sorry," she said softly. Henry shook his head. "I only tell you so you know that I understand. That first night after Catherine died, I rode out into the darkness with my rifle, planning to end it. I was so sure I could not survive the pain. But something stopped me. Maybe cowardice, maybe stubbornness. I made it through that night, then the next, then months and years. The pain never disappears entirely, but it becomes something you can carry." "I do not think I can carry it," Penelope whispered. "You can," Henry said with quiet certainty. "You are stronger than you know. You dug that grave with your bare hands in freezing weather. You loved him enough to give him that dignity. That takes strength most people do not possess." Penelope wanted to argue, to insist she was broken beyond repair, but exhaustion was finally overwhelming her. Her eyes grew heavy, and the last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Henry settling more comfortably against the wall, keeping watch through the night. She woke to gray dawn light filtering through the shack's single window and the smell of coffee. Henry had somehow produced hardtack and bacon from his supplies and was cooking breakfast on the stove. The storm had passed, leaving the world outside blanketed in pristine white. They ate in companionable silence. Then Henry helped Penelope back into her own clothes, which he had dried by the fire during the night. The dress was wrinkled and stained, but at least it was warm. As Henry saddled his horse, Penelope stepped outside and looked back in the direction of her homestead, invisible beyond the snow-covered hills. "I need to go back," she said. "I cannot just leave everything." Henry paused in tightening the cinch. "There is nothing to go back to," he said gently. "Your house was ransacked. The livestock are gone, and those raiders could return." "Thomas's grave," Penelope said, her voice breaking. "I cannot just abandon him." Henry came to stand beside her, following her gaze across the white landscape. "You are not abandoning him. His memory stays with you, but the dead are beyond our help, and you need to think about your own survival now." Penelope knew he was right, but the knowledge did nothing to ease the guilt that gnawed at her. Still, when Henry helped her onto the horse, she did not protest. They rode through the snow toward Newton, arriving in town by mid-morning. Newton, in December of 1876, was a rough cattle town past its wildest days, but still raw around the edges. The main street was a frozen mud track lined with false-fronted buildings, and the few people out in the cold moved quickly between destinations. Henry took Penelope directly to the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Sarah Mitchell, a stern but kind woman in her 50s who took one look at Penelope's face and ushered her inside without questions. "She lost her husband yesterday," Henry explained quietly while Mrs. Mitchell settled Penelope into a chair by the parlor fire. "Sioux raid. I found her at the homestead." Mrs. Mitchell's expression softened. She had lost her own husband to a horse accident 3 years prior and knew the particular devastation of sudden widowhood. "She can stay here as long as she needs," she said firmly. "Does she have family to contact?" Penelope roused herself enough to answer. "No one close. My parents died 5 years ago and I was an only child. Thomas had a brother in Colorado, but we were not in contact." "Then you stay here," Mrs. Mitchell said. "We will sort out the practicalities later." Henry lingered in the doorway, his hat in his hands, looking uncertain for the first time since Penelope had met him. She stood and crossed to him, surprising herself with the steadiness of her legs. "Thank you," she said, meeting his eyes. "You saved my life." "Anyone would have done the same," Henry said, but they both knew that was not true. The frontier was full of men who would have ridden past, unwilling to involve themselves in another person's tragedy. "Will you come back?" Penelope asked, then felt foolish for the question. Why would he? He had fulfilled his duty by bringing her to safety, but Henry nodded slowly. "I will check on you," he said. "Make sure you are settling in all right." He hesitated, then added, "If you need anything, send word to the Johnson Ranch. I will come." Then he was gone, his boots echoing on the wooden steps as he descended to the street. Penelope watched through the window as he mounted his horse and rode north out of town, feeling an unexpected hollowness at his departure that had nothing to do with Thomas's death, and everything to do with the strange connection she had felt to this quiet cowboy who understood grief. The next weeks passed in a gray haze. Mrs. Mitchell proved to be exactly what Penelope needed, providing structure and routine without demanding conversation or explanations. There were other women boarding at the house, a school teacher named Margaret Ross and a seamstress named Violet Perry, both unmarried and both kind in their different ways. They included Penelope in their meals and evening activities without pressing her to participate more than she could manage. Penelope spent her days helping with household tasks, finding some comfort in the mindless repetition of washing dishes, mending linens, preparing vegetables for dinner. Her hands healed slowly, the wounds closing into pink scars that she knew would fade with time. If only the wounds inside could heal as visibly. She tried not to think about the homestead, about whether animals had gotten to Thomas's grave, about the house she would never see again. She tried not to think about the future, which stretched before her as blank and featureless as the snowy plains. She was a widow at 22, with no money, no family, no prospects. The reality of her situation should have terrified her, but she felt too numb to feel much of anything. Henry Fletcher did not come back. Penelope told herself she had not expected him to, that his promise had been merely politeness, that a working cowboy had no time to check on stray widows he happened to rescue. But still, every time the door opened, every time boots sounded on the porch, her heart would lift foolishly before disappointment settled back in. Christmas came and went, a subdued affair at the boarding house. Penelope sat through the church service and the holiday dinner feeling like a ghost observing the living. When the other women exchanged small gifts, she had nothing to offer and accepted their kindness with burning shame. January brought brutal cold and a new round of snow. The boarding house felt increasingly claustrophobic, and Penelope found herself taking long walks despite the weather, needing to move, to feel something beyond the constant ache of loss. On one of these walks, nearly 6 weeks after Thomas's death, she stood in front of the general store watching a ranch family load supplies into their wagon and felt a stab of envy so sharp it took her breath away. That should have been her and Thomas, provisioning their homestead, building their future. Instead, she was alone and purposeless. Mrs. Carter, Penelope turned at the sound of her name and found Henry Fletcher standing a few feet away, looking uncertain. Her heart lurched at the sight of him, and she realized with some surprise that she was genuinely happy to see him. "Mr. Fletcher," she said, trying to keep her voice neutral, "I thought perhaps you had forgotten your promise to check on me." Something like guilt crossed Henry's face. "I am sorry for the delay. We had trouble at the ranch, sick cattle, and I could not get away." He gestured toward the restaurant across the street. "Could I buy you coffee? I would like to hear how you are managing." They settled into a corner table at the restaurant, which was nearly empty in the mid-afternoon lull. Henry ordered coffee and pie for them both despite Penelope's protests that she was not hungry. When the waitress left, an awkward silence descended. "You look better," Henry finally said. "More color in your face." "I am surviving," Penelope said, "which I suppose is all anyone can ask." "It is a start," Henry agreed. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, and Penelope noticed the deep calluses, the old rope burns, the evidence of a life spent in hard physical labor. "Have you thought about what you will do, long term?" Penelope shook her head. "Mrs. Mitchell has been kind enough to let me work for my room and board, but I cannot impose on her charity forever. I suppose I should find proper employment, perhaps as a seamstress or housekeeper. Though I have no references and little experience." "There may be another option," Henry said slowly. "The reason I came to town today, beyond wanting to check on you. My employer, Mrs. Johnson, lost her cook to retirement. She is looking for someone to take over the kitchen. The pay is decent, room and board included. I mentioned that I knew someone who might be interested, and she said to bring you out to the ranch if you wanted to interview." Penelope stared at him. "You secured me a job interview." "I suggested you for one," Henry corrected. "Mrs. Johnson makes her own decisions, but I thought it might suit you better than staying in town. The ranch is a good place, and Mrs. Johnson is fair." Something warm unfurled in Penelope's chest, the first positive feeling she had experienced in weeks. "Why would you do this for me? You barely know me." Henry met her eyes steadily. "Because everyone deserves a chance to rebuild. Because you should not have to spend your life in that boarding house mourning what you have lost. And because I would like to think that if Catherine had survived me instead of the other way around, someone would have helped her too." Penelope felt tears prickling her eyes but blinked them back. "When would Mrs. Johnson like to meet me?" "Tomorrow, if you are willing. I can pick you up at first light, have you back by evening." "All right," Penelope said. "Yes, thank you." They finished their coffee and pie, the conversation gradually becoming easier as Henry told her stories about the Johnson Ranch and its inhabitants. He painted a picture of a sprawling operation run by a widow who had taken over after her husband's death, and made a success of it through sheer determination. Penelope found herself drawn in, asking questions, feeling something like hope beginning to stir. When they parted outside the restaurant, Henry tipped his hat to her. "I will see you tomorrow, Mrs. Carter." "Penelope," she said impulsively. "Please call me Penelope." Henry smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually serious face. "Penelope," he agreed, "and you should call me Henry." That night, Penelope told Mrs. Mitchell about the potential job. The older woman was encouraging, helping her wash and press her best dress, lending her a proper coat for the journey. Margaret and Violet were excited on her behalf, chattering about the possibilities, and Penelope found herself caught up in their enthusiasm despite her nervousness. Henry arrived exactly at dawn, driving a buckboard wagon rather than riding horseback. The 8-mile journey to the Johnson Ranch took them through beautiful winter-locked country, the snow-covered plains stretching endlessly under a pale blue sky. Henry pointed out landmarks and told stories about the area, and Penelope found herself relaxing, even laughing at one of his drier observations about a neighboring rancher's stubborn mule. The Johnson Ranch was larger and more prosperous than Penelope had imagined. The main house was a 2-story frame structure painted white, with a wide porch and glass windows that spoke of substantial success. Outbuildings dotted the property, including a large barn, bunkhouse, and various sheds and corrals. Cattle bearing the Johnson brand grazed in distant pastures, and horses moved in the near paddock. Mrs. Eleanor Johnson turned out to be a handsome woman in her late 40s, with steel gray hair and sharp blue eyes that assessed Penelope thoroughly. She invited them into a warm parlor and served tea with her own hands before getting down to business. "Henry speaks well of you," Mrs. Johnson said, "though he admits you have only met under difficult circumstances. Tell me about your cooking experience." Penelope answered honestly, explaining that she had run her own household and cooked for herself and Thomas but had no professional experience. She described the kinds of meals she could prepare, her comfort with baking, her willingness to learn. Mrs. Johnson listened carefully, then said, "I will be frank with you, Mrs. Carter. This is a working ranch with 12 full-time hands plus seasonal workers during roundup and cattle drives. That means cooking 3 large meals a day, plus providing trail food for the men working distant pastures. It is physically demanding work with long hours, but you would have your own cottage, a decent salary, and 1 full day off each week. Are you prepared for that kind of labor?" Penelope thought about the weeks of numbing routine at the boarding house, the sense of drifting through days without purpose or direction. "Yes," she said firmly. "I need to work, Mrs. Johnson. I need to feel useful again." Something shifted in Mrs. Johnson's expression, a softening that suggested understanding. "Then let me show you the kitchen and cottage, and you can decide if it suits you." The ranch kitchen was a large, well-equipped room attached to the main house, but with its own entrance. It featured a massive cast iron range, long work tables, and shelves stocked with supplies. The cottage was a small 2-room structure behind the main house, simply furnished but clean and private. Penelope fell in love with it immediately, seeing in it the possibility of sanctuary and independence. "I will take the position," she said, "if you are willing to give me a chance." "I am," Mrs. Johnson said. "When can you start?" "Next week," Penelope suggested, thinking of the need to settle things at the boarding house and prepare herself mentally for this new chapter. "Next Monday then, Mrs. Johnson agreed, and they shook hands on it. The ride back to Newton felt shorter, buoyed by Penelope's relief and tentative excitement. Henry seemed pleased, though he said little, just smiled when she thanked him again for the opportunity. "You earned it yourself," he said. "I only made the introduction." "Still," Penelope insisted, "I will not forget your kindness." The following Monday, Henry returned with the buckboard to help Penelope move her few possessions to the ranch. Mrs. Mitchell and the other women saw her off with hugs and good wishes, making Penelope promise to visit when she came to town. As they drove north through the winter landscape, Penelope felt something she had not experienced since Thomas's death: anticipation for the future. She threw herself into the work with desperate energy, determined to prove herself worthy of Mrs. Johnson's faith. The days were indeed long and physically taxing. She rose before dawn to get breakfast ready for the ranch hands, who came in cold and hungry at 6 o'clock. After cleaning up, she immediately started preparing the substantial midday meal that had to be ready by noon. Afternoons were spent baking bread, preparing supper, and doing the endless washing up. She fell into bed each night exhausted but satisfied, too tired for the grief to overwhelm her. The ranch hands were initially wary of the new cook, having loved the previous one, but Penelope won them over with generous portions and genuine care. She learned their preferences, made special efforts for birthdays, and treated them with the respect that men doing hard physical labor deserved. They responded with courtesy and gradual friendliness, making her feel welcomed into the ranch community. Henry was often among those eating in the cookhouse, and Penelope found herself increasingly aware of his presence. He would thank her quietly for each meal, sometimes lingering to help carry heavy pots or haul water when he saw her struggling. They fell into an easy companionship, built on small kindnesses and growing familiarity. February gave way to March, the snow gradually melting to reveal the muddy reality of early spring. Penelope had been at the ranch 2 months, and the acute edge of her grief had dulled to a manageable ache. She still thought of Thomas every day, still dreamed sometimes of that terrible afternoon, but the memories no longer paralyzed her. She was healing, slowly but surely. One evening after supper service, Henry appeared at the kitchen door with a concerned expression. "Penelope, could you come with me for a moment? Mrs. Johnson needs to speak with you." Penelope's heart sank, immediately fearing she had done something wrong. She wiped her hands on her apron and followed Henry to the main house, where Mrs. Johnson waited in her study. "Sit down, Mrs. Carter," the older woman said, gesturing to a chair. "I have received some correspondence that concerns you." Penelope sat, her stomach knotted with anxiety. Mrs. Johnson handed her an official-looking letter, and Penelope scanned it quickly, her confusion growing. "I do not understand," she said. "This is from a lawyer in Colorado. Thomas Carter's brother," Mrs. Johnson explained. "He has been looking for you. Apparently, Thomas had a small life insurance policy that you are the beneficiary of. Not a fortune, but a decent sum. The brother also wants to know if you wish to sell the homestead. He has found a buyer willing to pay a fair price despite the condition." Penelope stared at the letter, feeling dizzy. She had not even considered these practical matters, too overwhelmed by loss to think about Thomas's estate or her legal rights as his widow. "What should I do?" she asked, looking between Mrs. Johnson and Henry. "That is entirely your decision," Mrs. Johnson said gently. "But I would suggest responding to the lawyer, sorting out these affairs. It could give you some financial security, which is nothing to dismiss lightly." Over the next weeks, with Mrs. Johnson's help, Penelope corresponded with the lawyer and eventually traveled by train to Pueblo, Colorado, to meet Thomas's brother, Robert Carter. The meeting was awkward and sad. two people brought together by shared loss who were otherwise strangers. Robert was kind enough, expressing genuine sorrow over Thomas's death and treating Penelope with careful respect. The insurance settlement and sale of the homestead left Penelope with nearly $800, more money than she had ever possessed in her life. It should have brought relief or happiness, but instead, she felt strangely empty, as though accepting the money was a final acknowledgement that Thomas was truly gone, that their dreams together were permanently ended. When she returned to the Johnson Ranch in early April, spring was transforming the landscape. Green grass pushed through the dead brown of winter, wildflowers dotted the prairie, and the cattle were being moved to summer pastures. Life was reasserting itself everywhere she looked. Henry met her at the train station in Newton, and the smile that crossed his face when he saw her made something flutter in Penelope's chest. During her absence, she had realized how much she had missed seeing him, how his quiet presence had become a touchstone in her daily life. "How did it go?" he asked as they drove back to the ranch. Penelope told him about Robert Carter, about signing the papers and accepting the money. "I keep thinking I should feel something," she said. "Relief or sadness or something, but I just feel numb." "Sometimes closure does not feel like anything," Henry said. "Sometimes it is just the absence of unfinished business. The feelings come later." They rode in comfortable silence for a while before Penelope said, "Thank you for meeting me. You did not have to take time from your work." "I wanted to," Henry said simply. "I was worried about you traveling alone, dealing with all that." "I am stronger than I look," Penelope said, echoing words he had once said to her. Henry glanced at her, and something in his expression made her breath catch. "I know," he said quietly. "I have watched you prove it every day." Life at the ranch settled back into routine, but something had shifted between Penelope and Henry. She found herself seeking him out during breaks in her work, and he would appear with increasing frequency to help with tasks she could have managed alone. They talked while she kneaded bread dough and he repaired tack, about everything and nothing, building a friendship that felt increasingly precious. One warm evening in May, after the supper dishes were finished, Henry asked if she would like to walk out to see the new calves in the near pasture. Penelope agreed readily, and they strolled through the long spring grass as the sun set in spectacular colors across the western sky. "I have been thinking," Henry said as they leaned against the pasture fence watching the calves play, "about what you said about feeling numb when you settled Thomas's affairs." "Yes," Penelope prompted when he fell silent. "I think maybe that is how you know you are ready to start living again," Henry said carefully, "when the past becomes just information instead of open wounds. When you can remember without bleeding." Penelope considered this, watching a calf buck and kick with pure joy. "Do you feel that way about Catherine?" "I do now," Henry said. "It took a long time. I loved her deeply, and losing her felt like losing part of myself. But eventually, I realized that honoring her memory did not mean refusing to live. She would have wanted me to be happy, to find purpose and connection again." He turned to look at Penelope, his hazel eyes serious in the fading light. "I think Thomas would want the same for you." "Perhaps," Penelope whispered, her heart beginning to race because she could sense something significant building between them. "Penelope," Henry said, his voice rough with emotion, "I need to be honest with you. When I found you that night in the snow, I was just doing what anyone decent would do. But over these months, getting to know you, watching you survive and rebuild, I have come to care for you, deeply. And I hope, that maybe you feel something similar." Penelope could not breathe. She had been so focused on surviving her grief that she had not allowed herself to name what she felt for Henry, but now, faced with his admission, she could not deny it. "I do," she said. I care for you too, but Henry, I am frightened. What if I am not ready? What if I am betraying Thomas by feeling this way? Henry reached out and took her hand, his touch warm and solid. You are not betraying anyone by choosing to live and love again. Thomas had a part of your heart and he always will, but hearts are not finite things. They expand to hold what we need them to hold. When did you become so wise? Penelope asked, tears streaming down her cheeks, though these were different from the tears she had shed in the snow 5 months ago. These tears contained hope and fear and possibility. I am not wise, Henry said, using his free hand to gently wipe her tears away, echoing that first night when he had wiped away her tears in the snow. I am just a man who knows what loss feels like and what it means to find something worth holding on to again. I would like to court you properly, Penelope. Take time, do things right. I am not asking you to rush into anything just to give us a chance. Penelope looked at him, this good, patient man who had appeared in her darkest hour and had been quietly steady ever since. She thought about Thomas, about the love they had shared, and felt certain in her bones that he would not want her to spend her life alone and mourning. He had been a generous soul who wanted happiness for everyone he loved. Yes, she said, I would like that. I would like to see where this leads. Henry smiled, that rare, transforming smile that made him handsome, and squeezed her hand gently. They stood together as darkness fell, watching the stars emerge, neither needing to fill the comfortable silence with words. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Penelope had experienced with Thomas. Where her first romance had been whirlwind passion and grand gestures, her growing relationship with Henry was built on steady accumulation of small moments. He brought her wildflowers he found while riding fence lines. She saved him extra biscuits from breakfast. They took evening walks and talked about their pasts, their dreams, the practical realities of frontier life. Henry spoke about Catherine with love but without pain, helping Penelope understand that it was possible to honor the dead while embracing the living. Penelope found herself opening up about things she had never told anyone, her fears and insecurities, her moments of doubt. Henry listened without judgment, offering comfort when she needed it and space when she did not. He never pressured her for more than she was ready to give, content to let their relationship develop at its own pace. The ranch community watched this courtship with approval. Mrs. Johnson particularly seemed pleased, mentioning casually one day that it was nice to see two people who understood life's hardships finding happiness together. The other ranch hands treated Penelope with protective affection, making clear that anyone who hurt her would answer to them, even if that person was their friend Henry. Summer arrived with its brutal heat and endless work. Roundup season meant extra hands to feed, longer hours in the hot kitchen, and barely any time to herself. But Henry was patient, stealing moments when he could, always there with a smile or encouraging word when she was exhausted. In July, nearly 8 months after Thomas's death, Henry asked Penelope if she would accompany him to Newton for the Independence Day celebration. It would be their first public appearance as a courting couple, and Penelope felt nervous about facing the townspeople who had known her as Thomas's widow. But Henry's steady presence gave her courage. The celebration was a cheerful affair with music, dancing, food, and fireworks after dark. Penelope saw familiar faces from the boarding house, and Mrs. Mitchell pulled her aside to squeeze her hands and whisper, "I am so happy for you, dear. You deserve this." When the dancing started, Henry led Penelope onto the floor with endearing seriousness, holding her properly at a respectful distance, despite the fact that she wanted nothing more than to melt into him. They moved through a waltz, then a livelier square dance, and Penelope laughed with pure joy for the first time in a year. When Henry looked at her with open adoration, she felt something fundamental click into place inside her chest. That night, as they drove back to the ranch under a canopy of stars, Penelope rested her head on Henry's shoulder and said, "I am happy. I did not think I would ever feel happy again, but I am." Henry kissed the top of her head gently. "You deserve happiness, Penelope. You deserve everything good." "So do you," she said fiercely, looking up at him. "You have been alone too long, carrying your grief like a burden you had no right to put down. But you deserve love and partnership and joy, Henry Fletcher." "I have found it," Henry said simply. "In you." They sat in the darkness of the buckboard, the horse knowing its way home, and kissed for the first time. It was sweet and tender and filled with promise, and when they finally pulled apart, both were trembling. "I love you," Penelope whispered, surprising herself with the admission. "I love you too," Henry said. "I have for a while now, but I was waiting for the right moment to say it." "Is this the right moment?" Penelope asked, smiling. "Every moment with you feels right," Henry said, then laughed at his own sentimentality. "Listen to me, talking like a dime novel." "I like it," Penelope assured him. "I like everything about you." They courted for another 3 months with increasing seriousness, and in October of 1877, just under a year after Thomas's death, Henry formally proposed. He did it simply, on one of their evening walks, dropping to one knee in the prairie grass and offering her a plain gold band that had belonged to his grandmother. "I know it has not been long," he said, "and I know you have been through more pain than anyone should bear. But I love you, Penelope, and I want to build a life with you. Will you marry me?" Penelope pulled him to his feet and kissed him thoroughly before answering. "Yes," she said. "1,000 times yes. You have given me back my life, Henry. You have shown me that love does not end, it just transforms. I want to be your wife." They married in a small ceremony in Newton in November, with Mrs. Johnson, the ranch hands, and Penelope's friends from the boarding house in attendance. Penelope wore a simple blue dress rather than white, feeling that was more appropriate for a widow remarrying. But when Henry saw her, his face lit with such unguarded love that she felt beautiful anyway. The ceremony was brief but heartfelt, conducted by the same minister who had presided over countless frontier weddings and funerals. When Henry slipped the gold band onto Penelope's finger, she felt Thomas's memory settle peacefully into the past. No longer a source of pain, but a reminder that she had loved and been loved, and could do so again. Mrs. Johnson gifted them a small house on the ranch property, a 2-bedroom structure that had been used for storage but which she had quietly fixed up. It was not grand, but it was theirs, and Penelope fell in love with it immediately. The first night in their new home, Henry carried her over the threshold despite her laughing protests, and they christened their marriage bed with tender passion that spoke of healing and hope. Their life together settled into a comfortable pattern. Penelope continued cooking for the ranch, though Henry helped whenever he could, and they made their little house into a true home. They talked about everything, worked through small conflicts with patience and respect, and built the kind of partnership that only comes from two people who have known loss and choose not to take each other for granted. In the spring of 1878, Penelope realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with complicated emotions, joy mixed with fear and even a thread of guilt, as though carrying another man's child somehow dishonored Thomas. Henry, with his usual wisdom, sat with her through these feelings without trying to fix them. "This is our child," he said, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "Mine and yours. What you had with Thomas was real and important, but this is something new. You are allowed to be happy about it." "I am happy," Penelope said, tears in her eyes. "I am terrified, but I am happy." The pregnancy was mercifully uneventful. And in December of 1878, 2 years after that terrible night in the snow, Penelope gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Samuel Henry Fletcher, and when the doctor placed him in her arms, Penelope wept with joy and relief. Henry was equally moved, holding his son with shaking hands and tears streaming down his weathered face. "Thank you," he whispered to Penelope. "Thank you for this gift, for trusting me enough to build a family." "Thank you for finding me," Penelope said. "For wiping away my tears that night and every night since. For showing me that endings can become beginnings." Samuel was a good baby, healthy and relatively calm, and Penelope discovered that motherhood suited her. Mrs. Johnson was supportive, adjusting Penelope's duties so she could care for the infant, and Henry was a devoted father despite his long work hours. The ranch community embraced little Samuel, and he was rarely without someone willing to hold or entertain him. Life continued its forward momentum. The cattle business thrived, seasons changed, and the Fletcher family grew roots deep into the Kansas soil. In the summer of 1880, Penelope gave birth to a daughter they named Catherine Aliner, honoring both Henry's first wife and Mrs. Johnson. The addition of a second child made their little house feel wonderfully full and chaotic. Penelope sometimes thought about Thomas, especially on the anniversary of his death, but the memories had lost their sharp edges. She could remember him with fondness and gratitude for the time they had shared without feeling devastated by his loss. Henry understood when she needed to be quiet and reflective on those difficult days, giving her space while making sure she knew he was there if needed. In 1882, Mrs. Johnson suffered a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. She recovered enough to move around with assistance, but could no longer manage the ranch's daily operations. She shocked everyone by announcing that she was selling the Johnson Ranch to Henry and Penelope, who had proven themselves capable and trustworthy over the years. The price was more than fair, structured so they could pay it off over time, and Mrs. Johnson retained a suite of rooms in the main house where she would live out her remaining years. "I need to know this place will be in good hands," she told them. "You have both rebuilt yourselves here. Now build something lasting for your children." The responsibility was daunting but exciting. Henry proved to be an excellent rancher, combining practical skill with innovative ideas, while Penelope managed the household and gradually took over the ranch's books and correspondence. They made a formidable team, and the ranch continued to prosper under their stewardship. Their family expanded further with the birth of twin boys, Thomas Robert and William James, in 1884. Naming one of the twins after her first husband felt right to Penelope, a way of honoring that chapter of her life while fully embracing her present. Henry supported the decision completely, understanding her need to acknowledge all the pieces of her history. The children grew, the ranch flourished, and the years accumulated like a string of pearls, each one precious. Penelope and Henry aged together, their love deepening and maturing, weathering the inevitable challenges that came with building a life on the frontier. They lost cattle to harsh winters and disease, dealt with difficult employees and predatory neighbors, survived droughts and financial panics. But they faced everything together, partners in every sense of the word. Mrs. Johnson lived to see the twins turn 5 before passing peacefully in her sleep in 1889. Her death saddened everyone who had known her, but she left behind a legacy of strength and fairness that shaped how Penelope and Henry ran the ranch. They buried her in the small cemetery at the edge of the property, where other ranch family members rested, and planted a beautiful rosebush over her grave. As the 1890s dawned, the wild frontier was gradually being tamed. More settlers arrived, towns grew larger, railroads connected previously isolated communities. The raw violence and lawlessness of earlier decades gave way to a more settled, civilized existence. Newton transformed from a rough cattle town into a proper community with schools, churches, and even a small library. The Fletcher children thrived in this changing world. Samuel grew into a serious, responsible young man who shared his father's love of ranching. Catherine was bright and curious, constantly reading and asking questions that challenged her parents to explain complex ideas. The twins were energetic and mischievous, keeping everyone on their toes but also bringing laughter and joy into every day. In the summer of 1895, when Samuel was 16 and beginning to take on serious responsibilities around the ranch, Penelope realized she was pregnant again. The discovery shocked both her and Henry, who had assumed their family was complete. At 39, Penelope had not expected to bear another child, and the pregnancy was more difficult than the previous ones, leaving her exhausted and frequently ill. Henry was attentive to the point of being overprotective, and Penelope had to constantly reassure him that she was all right. The memory of losing Catherine in childbirth haunted him, despite the many years that had passed, and he could not quite shake his fear. Their youngest child, a daughter they named Grace Ellen, was born in February of 1896 after a long and difficult labor. She was small but healthy, with her mother's blonde hair and her father's hazel eyes. Henry held her and cried with relief, and Penelope felt a profound sense of completion, as though their family was now truly whole. Grace proved to be a delightful surprise, a sweet-natured child who brought unexpected joy into their lives. The older children doted on their baby sister, and watching Samuel, now nearly 17, carefully cradle the infant reminded Penelope of how far they had all come. One evening in the spring of 1897, Penelope stood on the porch of the main house, now indisputably the Fletcher house, watching her family scattered across the ranch yard. Samuel was working with his father to repair a fence section. Catherine sat under a tree reading to the twins. Inside, Grace slept in the cradle Henry had built with his own hands. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and pink, painting the prairie in colors so beautiful they seemed almost unreal. Henry came to stand beside her, slipping an arm around her waist. They were both in their early 40s now, their hair showing threads of gray, their faces marked by weather and time. But Penelope thought Henry had never been more handsome than he was in that moment, looking at their children with such obvious pride and love. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking about snow," Penelope said. "About a night over 20 years ago when I was certain my life was over. I was weeping into the snow, convinced I could not survive the pain, and then a cowboy wiped my tears away and saved me." Henry pulled her closer. "You saved yourself," he said. "I just happened to be there." "No," Penelope said firmly. "You saved me. You gave me hope when I had none. You showed me that love does not end with death, it just changes form. You taught me that happiness is possible even after devastating loss. You saved me, Henry, in every way a person can be saved." "Then we saved each other," Henry said, "because you gave me back a life worth living. After Catherine died, I was just going through motions, existing but not truly alive. You changed that. You and our children, this family we have built, this is everything I thought I had lost forever." They stood together as darkness gathered, watching their children, secure in their love and partnership. Inside the house, Grace began to cry, wanting her evening feeding, and Penelope moved to care for her. Henry followed, and they moved through the familiar evening routine of settling children, banking fires, preparing for the night. Later, lying in their bed with Henry's arms around her, Penelope thought about the two very different men she had loved. Thomas had been her first love, passionate and romantic, full of dreams but ultimately unprepared for the harsh realities of frontier life. Henry was steady and strong, a man forged by loss into someone capable of deep compassion and enduring commitment. She had loved them both in different ways, and both loves had shaped who she was. "I never told you," Penelope said quietly into the darkness. "That night you found me, after you wiped my tears away, I felt something. It was just a spark, barely noticeable under all the grief, but it was there. Recognition, maybe, or hope. Something in me knew even then that you were important." "I felt it too," Henry admitted. "And it terrified me because I thought I was betraying Catherine by feeling anything for another woman so soon. It took me time to understand that the heart makes room." "The heart makes room," Penelope repeated, liking the phrase. "That is exactly right." They made love slowly, tenderly, a reaffirmation of all they had built together. Afterward, drifting toward sleep, Penelope sent a silent thank you into the universe, to whatever force had brought Henry Fletcher riding through the snow that terrible December night. His simple act of kindness had changed the trajectory of her entire life. The years continued their steady march. The children grew and began making their own paths in the world. Samuel eventually married a rancher's daughter from a neighboring county and brought her to the Fletcher Ranch, where they built a house near the main one and began their own family. Catherine went east to attend college, one of the first women from Newton to do so, and returned with a teaching certificate and ideas about starting a school on the ranch for the children of workers. The twins grew into capable young men who loved the land as much as their father did. Grace remained the baby of the family, bright and charming and thoroughly spoiled by her older siblings. Henry and Penelope aged into grandparenthood with Grace, delighting in Samuel's children and eventually Catherine's when she married a lawyer from Newton and started her own family. The ranch continued to prosper under their management, and they became respected members of the community, known for their fairness and generosity. On their 20th wedding anniversary in November of 1897, Henry surprised Penelope with a trip to Denver. It was the first time either of them had left Kansas in years, and they reveled in the luxury of a fine hotel, good restaurants, and time alone together without children or ranch responsibilities. On their last evening, standing on their hotel balcony looking at the distant mountains, Henry pulled out a small box. "I never properly gave you an engagement ring," he said. "We were both so practical, so focused on just moving forward. But I want you to have something beautiful, something that reflects how precious you are to me." Inside the box was a delicate gold ring set with 3 small diamonds, not ostentatious but lovely. Penelope cried as Henry slipped it onto her finger beside her wedding band. 20 years, she said. 20 years of partnership and love and building something meaningful. Henry, you are my great love, my best friend, my partner in everything. I cannot imagine my life without you. You will never have to, Henry promised. We are bound together now for whatever years remain. And when we eventually join Catherine and Thomas and all the others who have gone before, we will go knowing we lived fully and loved deeply. They returned to the ranch refreshed and even more committed to each other. As the new century approached, they began to feel the weight of their years, but also the satisfaction of lives well lived. They had survived terrible losses, rebuilt themselves from ruins, and created something lasting and good. On New Year's Eve of 1899, as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the entire Fletcher family gathered at the main house for a celebration. Children and grandchildren filled every room, 3 generations of love and survival. At midnight, when the clock struck 12, Henry pulled Penelope close and kissed her thoroughly, not caring that their adult children laughed at this public display of affection. "To the new century," he said, raising a glass of cider. "May it be as kind to our children and grandchildren as the last decades have been to us." They all toasted, and Penelope looked around the room at the family she and Henry had built together, at the legacy they would leave behind. Her eyes filled with happy tears, and Henry, as always, was there to wipe them away, just as he had been that first terrible night in the snow. "Happy?" he asked softly, for her ears alone. "Happier than I ever imagined possible," Penelope said truthfully. "You gave me everything, Henry. You gave me back my life, my heart, my future. You are my home, my love, my forever." "As you are mine," Henry said, "always and forever." They stood together surrounded by family and love, two people who had found each other in the darkness and built something radiant and enduring. The snow had long since melted. The tears had dried, but the love remained constant and true, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the transformative power of compassion. In the years that followed, they would face new challenges and joys. Grandchildren would be born and grow. Technology would change the world around them. But through it all, Henry and Penelope Fletcher remained partners, anchored by the love that had saved them both and by the choice they made every day to honor that gift. When Henry died peacefully in his sleep in 1912, at the age of 66, Penelope mourned deeply, but without the devastating despair of her youth. They had been granted 31 years together, years full of purpose and meaning and love. She knew she would join him eventually, and the thought brought comfort rather than fear. She lived another 8 years, staying active in ranch management with Samuel's help, watching her grandchildren grow into adults, holding great-grandchildren in her arms. She kept Henry's memory alive through stories, and made sure her descendants understood the legacy of kindness and second chances that had made their family possible. When Penelope Carter Fletcher died in the spring of 1920 at the age of 64, she was surrounded by 3 generations of family, all of whom owed their existence to a cowboy who had stopped to help a weeping widow on a terrible winter night. They buried her beside Henry in the family cemetery, under the wide Kansas sky they had both loved. The epitaph on their shared headstone reads simply, "They found each other in the storm and built a life in the sunshine, forever beloved, forever together." The ranch continued under Samuel's stewardship, passing eventually to his children, and then their children, each generation adding their own chapters to the Fletcher story. But it all traced back to that December night in 1876, to tears falling into snow, to a gentle hand wiping them away, to 2 broken hearts finding healing in each other. It traced back to the moment when Henry Fletcher proved that one act of compassion could change not just a life but generations, that love could rise from the ashes of loss, and that sometimes the end of one story was merely the beginning of something even more beautiful. The snow had melted, the cowboy had wiped the tears away, and in their place, love bloomed eternal, a testament to the enduring power of kindness and the limitless capacity of the human heart to heal, to hope, and to love again.